I work at a small office building in Cleveland. I usually have nights when I'm the only one there. I work late shifts because my boss says it's quieter and I can get more done. I never thought that being alone in an office late at night could turn into something I'd remember for the rest of my life. But one night, things went so wrong that I still wake up in a cold sweat sometimes just thinking about it. This is my story about that night, and I'm telling it slowly because even now, I still have to piece it all together. I don't like to make things sound dramatic, but what happened was very real and very scary. I work as an administrative assistant in a small company that rents space in an old office building downtown in Cleveland. Most days, I'm not on call after 6 p.m., but sometimes the boss asks me to stay late to finish up some work. I'm not complaining, the extra cash helps. I always felt safe there because I'd been working the job for almost 2 years with no problems. That fateful night started off like any other late night shift. I got home late from dinner, dropped off my coat, and sat at my desk to finish up some paperwork. The office was dark except for the desk lamp and a few overhead lights that I'd left on in the main room. The building was quiet. I listened to the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of the old pipes. I always liked the peace and quiet. It let me focus on my work. I remember checking the clock. It was about 8:15 p.m. when I was about halfway through a report. I typed slowly, my mind wandering to the ordinary things of my life. I had no idea that by 10 p.m. I would be fighting off something I never expected. At first, everything was normal. I would often work late by myself, and I was used to the silence. But that night, the silence started to feel different. It was around 8:45 p.m. when I first heard something that made me pause. I was typing away on my computer when I heard what sounded like a soft shuffling noise coming from the hallway outside my office. I stopped typing and listened carefully. It was not loud, just a quiet sound like someone slowly dragging their feet. I told myself it was probably just the building settling or maybe the janitor doing his rounds. I tried to ignore it and went back to my work, but the sound kept repeating every few minutes. I glanced at the clock again. The time was now almost 9 p.m. I felt a bit uneasy, but I figured it was nothing to worry about. The building was old and strange noises were not uncommon to me. I didn't think much of it until the shuffling sound seemed to get a little closer to my door. I remember sitting there, my heart starting to beat a little faster. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I kept telling myself that there was probably an explanation. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else might be in the building. After a few minutes, I tried to refocus on my report, but my mind was racing. I started thinking about the building's security. I locked the main entrance before I started my shift, but I never bothered to double-check all the side doors. The building was not the newest, and sometimes the locks were a bit old. I tried to push the worry aside, thinking that if someone was in the building, they'd probably be up to no good and would not come near me. About 9:15 p.m., the shuffling noise stopped completely. I sat in silence for a long minute, listening for any more sounds. Nothing. I told myself it was all in my head and went back to work. I saved my document and decided to take a short break. I got up and walked to the small kitchenette in the corner of the office to grab a cup of coffee. That's when I noticed something odd. The door to the hallway was slightly ajar. I knew I had closed it earlier when I got in. I hesitated for a moment, thinking maybe the wind had pushed it open, but Cleveland doesn't have strong winds in the fall. My heart started pounding as I slowly walked over to the door. I reached out and pulled the door closed. I remember pausing with my hand on the knob, trying to calm myself down. I told myself it was just a mistake. I was being paranoid. But I couldn't help looking down the hallway through the small gap. There was nothing there, just the dark, empty corridor lit by a few flickering lights. I forced a laugh, thinking that I was just tired. I closed the door properly this time and made my way back to my desk. When I returned, I felt a little off. I sat down and tried to focus on the report again, but my mind kept wandering back to that open door. I kept glancing at the hallway, half expecting to see someone standing there. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination or if something was really happening. I told myself that I needed to concentrate on the work. I had deadlines to meet, and I couldn't let fear stop me. Around 9:30 p.m., I heard a faint sound coming from somewhere in the building. It wasn't the shuffling noise from earlier, but something else. It was a low, muffled thud, like something heavy being dropped. I froze. My eyes widened, and I listened carefully. The sound came from somewhere near the storage room. I sat there, paralyzed for a moment, wondering if I should call someone. I checked my phone, but it wasn't hard to think of someone to call. I decided I would call my friend Mark, who worked in security at another building downtown. I dialed his number, and my hands were shaking as I waited for him to answer. When Mark picked up, I said, "Hey man, something weird is happening at work tonight. I'm alone in the building and I just heard something dropped in the storage room. You don't think someone's there, do you?" I tried to sound calm, but I knew I wasn't. Mark told me to be careful and asked if I was in a locked area. I said yes, but he insisted that I keep the door closed and maybe call the police if I felt unsafe. I thanked him and hung up. Even after that, the uneasy feeling in my stomach didn't go away. I decided to check the storage room. I didn't really want to leave my desk, but I felt I needed to know what was going on. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and slowly got up. I made sure to take the stairs down to the level where the storage room was located. The building's layout was something I knew well, so I didn't worry too much. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The closer I got, the louder my heart pounded. When I reached the storage room, I paused outside the door. The door was closed, but I could hear something another soft sound, like the rustle of papers. I wasn't sure if it was the wind or someone moving around. I tried to steady my breathing and told myself that I wasn't in danger. I knocked softly on the door. "Hello? Is anyone there?" I called out, my voice trembling a little. There was no answer. I waited a moment longer, and then slowly opened the door a crack. I didn't want to open it all the way, because I was scared of what I might see. The room was dimly lit by a single fluorescent light that flickered on the ceiling. I stepped inside cautiously, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. At first, nothing seemed wrong. The room had shelves of old files and a few boxes, but then I noticed a file folder that was lying on the floor as if someone had dropped it. I picked it up slowly. The folder had the name Wright on it, a name I recognized from a previous office project. I didn't know why it was there. I looked around for clues, but there was nothing else out of place. My mind started racing. Was someone in here? Did someone forget to lock the door? I shut the door behind me and checked the locks. Everything seemed secure. I then decided to return to my desk. As I walked back through the hall, I kept thinking about that folder. I wondered if it was left behind by a coworker or if it was evidence of something else. I couldn't tell at the time. Back at my desk, I tried to get back to work, but my focus was shot. I kept rereading the report and checking my email, but nothing seemed to be going right. I kept hearing small noises, the sound of footsteps behind me when I was alone, the soft creak of the floor as if someone had walked past. I told myself that it was just the building settling again, but deep down I felt something was very wrong. Around 9:50 p.m., I heard a loud bang coming from somewhere in the building. It was hard to tell exactly where, but it sounded like something had been thrown across the room. I froze, my heart racing so hard I could feel it pounding in my ears. I remembered what Mark had said about calling the police, but I wasn't sure if it was the right time. I sat there, paralyzed, trying to decide whether to run or hide. I finally decided to hide, not sure what I was dealing with. I looked around the office and saw that there was a small storage closet next to my desk. I remembered that it was usually locked, but I had a spare key because I sometimes needed to get supplies. I quietly made my way to the closet and unlocked it, slipping inside. The closet was cramped and filled with old office supplies and some extra coats. I crouched down and tried to stay as quiet as possible. I listened to the sounds in the hall. Everything was silent except for the distant hum of the air conditioner. Minutes passed and I couldn't tell how long I had been hiding. I kept thinking about what I had seen and heard. Every little sound made my heart race. I told myself that I should call the police, but my phone battery was low and I was scared that making a call might alert whoever was out there. I kept my eyes shut, trying to calm myself and plan my next move. I recall that I was hiding for what felt like an eternity, but when I peeked out the closet door, I saw something that I will never forget. A figure was slowly moving in the hallway. I couldn't see his face clearly because of the dim lighting, but he was wearing dark clothes and was moving in a deliberate, cautious way. I pressed myself further into the back of the closet, my heart nearly bursting out of my chest. I listened as the figure passed by my desk. I couldn't tell if he was looking for something or just wandering around. I barely dared to breathe. The figure eventually disappeared around the corner. I waited a few more minutes before I dared to open the door again. I wanted to call the police now, but I still wasn't sure if I was safe. I tiptoed out of the closet and made my way to the front door of the office. I quietly locked the door behind me and peered out into the lobby. The hallway was empty, but I could see shadows dancing under the light. I knew I needed help, so I finally used my phone to call the police. I told them that I believed someone was in the building and that I was alone, and I gave them my location. It wasn't long before I heard the sound of sirens in the distance, and I felt a small relief knowing that help was on the way. I stayed near the door, keeping an eye on the hallway, when I suddenly noticed that the folder from the storage room was lying on the floor near the entrance. My hands started to tremble again. I picked it up carefully, wondering what it meant. It seemed as though whoever was in the building might have left it behind, or maybe they dropped it by accident. I wasn't sure, but it added to the mystery. After what felt like an hour, the police arrived. 2 officers came into the building and asked me to stay near the front desk. I told them everything I had experienced, how I'd heard shuffling noises, the open door, the file folder, and even the figure in the hallway. They listened carefully and asked a lot of questions. I could tell they didn't immediately believe everything I said because the building was known for making noises. They searched the building thoroughly. I remember sitting there with my hands shaking, watching them move slowly through the hallways. It turned out that the police did find a few signs that someone had been in the building. They found a set of muddy footprints in one of the hallways and a broken window on the side of the building. The officers explained that someone had broken in and was likely looking for something specific, though they weren't entirely sure what that might be. I was told that the break-in likely happened while I was working, and that the intruder had probably already left by the time they arrived. I felt a mix of relief and shock. Relief because I wasn't hurt, but shock because the idea that someone could sneak into the building without my knowing made my skin crawl. Even after the police left, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I stayed in the building until my shift officially ended, and then I rushed home as fast as I could. I locked my door behind me and sat in silence for a long time, trying to process what had happened. I kept going over every detail in my head, the noises, the folder with the name right, the dark figure in the hallway. I didn't sleep well that night, and the next morning I was exhausted and still scared. In the days that followed, I started asking around at work. I talked to a few coworkers who had worked late before. One of them mentioned that a few weeks ago, someone had reported a break-in at another part of the building. I never paid much attention to it at the time because it was quickly dismissed as a random act of vandalism. But now I began to wonder if there was a connection. I felt like there was something more behind the break-in than a simple burglary. I did some research on my own and discovered that the building had a long history of minor break-ins and vandalism. It was an old building, and the security measures were not the best. I found online reports of similar incidents in the neighborhood, which made me feel even more uneasy. I didn't want to believe that someone could be stalking the building, but the evidence was starting to add up. I started to feel that the situation wasn't just a one-time event. Every time I worked late, I felt eyes watching me, and every time I heard a noise in the hallway, my heart would race. I even noticed that on some nights I would find small signs that something had been disturbed, like a chair that was slightly moved, or a light that flickered for no reason. I told myself that it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew that something was not right. One evening a week later, I was forced to confront my fears again. I was working on a particularly heavy project, and my boss had asked me to finish everything before the end of the night. It was nearly midnight when I was deep in thought, my eyes bleary from staring at the screen for too long. I decided to take a short break and walked over to the small kitchenette for another cup of coffee. The office was dark now, the only light coming from my computer screen and a couple of overhead fixtures. I was about to fill my cup when I heard a faint noise from the hallway this time. It was a quiet, deliberate tapping sound. I froze and listened. The tapping came again, almost like someone was knocking, but not on the door, just somewhere out in the corridor. I felt a chill run down my spine. I slowly moved back to the door of the kitchenette and peeked out. In the dim light, I saw nothing unusual except my own shadow. I pressed my lips together and tried to calm myself. Maybe it was just the wind or an animal outside. I decided to ignore it and finish making my coffee. But as I turned to go back to my desk, I caught a glimpse of movement in the reflection of the glass window. I looked up and saw a dark shape standing in the middle of the hallway, staring right at the window. I blinked, and it was gone. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things or if someone was really there. At that point, I knew I couldn't keep living in constant fear every time I stayed late. I decided to report the incident to my boss. When I explained what had happened, the noises, the open door, and the dark figure, I could see that he was worried too. He said that maybe we needed to improve the security on our floor. He promised to talk to the building management and see what could be done. But even as he reassured me, I knew that something deeper was at play. That night, I left work early, even though I had plenty more to finish. I hurried out of the building, checking over my shoulder more times than I could count. On the drive home through Cleveland's dark streets, I kept thinking about the intruder, about the unknown reason behind his presence. I wondered if he was just a petty thief or if he was someone with a more sinister motive. I kept asking myself questions that I couldn't answer. I tried to convince myself that the police had already taken care of it, that everything would be all right, but I couldn't shake the image of that dark figure from my mind. The next morning, I arrived at work feeling more anxious than ever. The memory of the previous night was still vivid and I was jumpy. I kept expecting to see the door open or to hear another noise, even though everything seemed normal during the day. I talked to a few coworkers, and while they reassured me that the building was safe, I couldn't help feeling that something was off. I started locking my own office door and double-checking it every time I left my desk. I even began to wonder if I should ask for a transfer to a different shift. One afternoon, about 3 days after that night, I was working late again. I had decided to stay on because there was an important project that needed my attention. I sat at my desk in the same office, feeling as tense as ever. I had kept the file folder with the name Wright tucked away in a drawer, thinking that maybe it held some clue as to who the intruder might be. I looked at it often, wondering if it was connected to something bigger than a simple break-in. I wasn't a detective, and I didn't have the experience to piece everything together, but the mystery was eating away at me. That night, as I was working, I heard footsteps in the hall again. This time they were slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth. I turned off my computer screen in hopes that darkness would hide me, but the hallway outside was still faintly lit by a few emergency lights. I listened as the footsteps passed by my office, stopping right outside my door for a few moments before moving on. I felt a wave of panic. I must have been trembling when I sat down again, and I could hardly get any work done. I decided that I needed to get out of the office for a bit to clear my head. I grabbed my coat and left my desk, careful not to make any noise. I walked slowly to the elevator, every step measured and quiet. The elevator ride felt like it lasted an eternity, each floor making my heart pound louder. When I reached the lobby, I took a deep breath and stepped outside into the cool night air. I stood there on the sidewalk, looking up at the building. It seemed so imposing in the dark. I tried to convince myself that I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. I decided to take a walk around the block to calm myself. Cleveland at night isn't always dangerous, but on that night, every shadow made me jump. I walked slowly, my hands buried in my pockets, my eyes darting around. I kept thinking about the folder and the footsteps, wondering if they were connected somehow. As I walked, I thought about my job, my life, and how something so ordinary could suddenly turn terrifying. I didn't have much of a vocabulary for fear, I just knew that I was scared, and I couldn't help it. When I finally got back to work, I found that I wasn't as tense as I'd been before, but the feeling of being watched still lingered. I locked my door again and tried to focus on the project in front of me. Hours passed slowly. I remember looking at the clock, watching the minutes tick by, each one feeling longer than the last. I was so deep in thought that I almost didn't notice the sound of someone approaching my desk. I looked up, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow move across the wall. I blinked and looked again, but there was nothing there. My heart pounded so hard that I thought it might burst. I kept working until I was nearly finished, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that dark figure in the hallway pacing slowly. I tried to rationalize it away, thinking it was just my imagination or the stress getting to me. But deep down, I knew that something was very, very wrong. As the night wore on, I made a decision. I was going to finish my project and then get out of the building as soon as possible. I saved my work and started packing up. I left my office quietly and headed for the exit, my heart pounding with every step. Just as I reached the main door, I heard a sound behind me, a soft whisper of movement. I turned around slowly, but all I saw was the empty corridor, dimly lit and silent. I pressed on, almost running the last few steps to the door. Outside, I locked the building behind me and started walking to my car in the parking lot. The cold night air hit me, and I felt a slight relief being out of the building. I got in my car and locked the doors, determined not to look back. I drove home quickly, my mind still replaying every moment of that night over and over again. The next morning, I couldn't concentrate at all. I went through the motions at work, but my mind was far away. I kept replaying the sounds, the footsteps, and that moment in the storage room. I even tried to talk to a coworker about it, but I couldn't find the right words. Everyone said that the building was old and that strange noises were to be expected, but they didn't really understand how scared I was. I felt isolated and confused, wondering if I was overreacting or if I should be worried. I didn't have the answers. I decided to do some research on the incidents that had been reported in the building. I asked the security guard if he remembered anything unusual, and he mentioned that a few months ago, there had been a small burglary in one of the offices. The details were sketchy, and he didn't know if it was related to the events of my night. I asked around a little more and found out that there were rumors of a group of people targeting old buildings in the area. They would sneak in, look for valuable files or equipment, and then leave without leaving much evidence. It was like a modern-day burglary, with a twist that made it feel more like a calculated crime than a random act of violence. I couldn't help but wonder if I had become an unintended target. My office wasn't known for anything valuable, but I had seen the folder with the name Wright and started to think that maybe there was more going on than just petty theft. I spent the next few days feeling jumpy and paranoid. I started double-checking locks and asking the building management if they planned to upgrade the security system. They said they would look into it, but nothing was done immediately. Then, one night, things escalated even further. I had been working late again, and I felt a lingering fear that I couldn't explain away. I tried to focus on my work, but every sound made me jump. Around 11 p.m., I heard a series of footsteps that were much louder and closer than before. I froze at my desk, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps seemed to circle around the office, and I thought I heard a door creak somewhere nearby. My heart was racing so fast I could barely think. I decided that I couldn't sit there any longer. I gathered my things and prepared to leave, even though I wasn't completely sure if I was alone. I moved slowly toward the exit, constantly checking behind me. As I reached the lobby, I saw that the front door was slightly open. I knew I had locked it earlier. I felt a lump form in my throat. I stepped outside cautiously, and that's when I saw him again, a man in dark clothing standing near the building's entrance. He was leaning against the wall, his face hidden in shadow. I stood frozen for a moment, my breath catching in my throat. He didn't move at first. I stared at him, not sure what to do. I wanted to run, but I was paralyzed with fear. Finally, he took a step forward. I couldn't tell if he was coming to me or just standing there. My mind raced, and I fumbled with my phone to call the police again. Before I could even dial, he started walking toward the door. I backed away slowly, my eyes locked on him. I wished I had never stayed so late at work, that I could have just left when I first felt uneasy. The man reached the door, and I could see that he was trying to force it open. I watched in horror as his hand gripped the handle and twisted it. I took a deep breath and decided that I had to do something. I shouted, "Hey, what are you doing?" My voice echoed in the cold night air. The man froze for a moment, then turned and bolted down the street. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding and my hands shaking. I didn't know whether to follow him or call the police immediately. I chose to call the police. I dialed 911, my voice trembling as I explained that there was an intruder at the building trying to break in. It took only a few minutes for the police to arrive. I stayed outside, my eyes scanning the dark street for any sign of the man. The officers questioned me and took my statement, asking me for every detail I could remember. I repeated everything: the sounds, the footsteps, the dark figure, and the face I almost saw when he turned. They told me that they would look into it and that I should try to go home if I felt safe. I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. After the police left again, I stood by the building for a while before finally heading to my car. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in my car on a friend's driveway until dawn, too scared to go inside my own house. I kept thinking about that dark figure and wondering if he would come back. Every creak, every sound felt like it was coming from him. I finally managed to get some sleep, but it was fitful and filled with nightmares of dark hallways and someone chasing me. In the following weeks, the break-in incident was investigated by the local police, and they did find more evidence that pointed to a small group of thieves who had been targeting older buildings in the area. I was told that they had caught one of the members of the group, but that the whole operation was still at large. Even though I was relieved that someone was being caught, the thought of these people lurking in the shadows made it hard for me to go back to work at night. I started to change my routines. I no longer stayed late unless it was absolutely necessary. I began to ask a coworker to stay with me if I had to work late, even if it was just for company. The building management promised to install better security cameras and improve the locks on the doors, but I still felt unsafe. Every time I passed the storage room or the hallway where I'd seen those muddy footprints, I was reminded of that terrifying night. Sometimes I still get a chill when I pass by the door that had been left open. I remember how my hands shook as I pulled it closed, and I think back to the file folder with the name Wright on it. I never found out what was in that folder or why it had been left there, but I sometimes wonder if it was a clue to something bigger. I asked a few people in the company about it, but no one seemed to remember anything about a Wright or any related documents. It was as if the folder had come out of nowhere and then vanished into thin air. I tried to forget it, but my mind wouldn't let me. The memory of that night made me realize that even in a place where you think you're safe, danger can be lurking around every corner. I never imagined that working alone at night would lead to such a terrifying experience, and I learned to trust my instincts a little more. Now, whenever I hear an odd noise or see something out of place, I pay extra attention. I've even taken some self-defense classes, just in case. I know that I'm not the only one who's had something like this happen, even if it doesn't get talked about much. There are plenty of stories out there of people who have had their nights turned upside down by a simple break-in or an unexpected encounter while they were alone. What makes these events so scary is not that they involve something supernatural or unexplainable, but that they are reminders that real life can be full of danger and unpredictability. Even now, months after that night, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, wondering if I'm still being watched. I try to tell myself that it's just my mind playing tricks on me, that the police have done their job and the thieves have been caught, but the feeling doesn't always go away. I have nightmares of dark hallways and the sound of footsteps that I can't quite place. I worry about the next time I have to work late, about whether I'll ever be able to relax in that building again. I've learned to take precautions. I always lock every door twice, I keep my phone closed, and I've even installed a small alarm on my desk. I let my coworkers know whenever I'm staying late, so someone always knows where I am. I know that I can't let my fear control my life, but it's hard when you've seen something that shakes you to your core. Sometimes I think about that file folder with "Right" written on it. I wonder if I'll ever know the full story behind it. Maybe it was just a random document that someone carelessly dropped, or maybe it was a clue to something more serious. I still have it tucked away in a drawer, and every time I see it, I get that same mix of curiosity and dread. I've never told anyone else about it, partly because I worry they won't believe me, and partly because I'm still too scared to face the possibility that there's more to it than I know. Looking back on it now, I realize that I was in a situation that most people would never imagine happening to them. I was alone in a building at night, with only my thoughts for company, and then something Somon had disrupted that isolation. It wasn't a ghost or a supernatural force. It was a real person with real intentions. And that made it all the more frightening because it meant that danger could be hiding in plain sight, in a place that should have been safe. I try to focus on the fact that I'm safe now, that I survived that night, and that I'm taking steps to protect myself. I still work late sometimes, but I'm never truly alone anymore. I make sure to have someone with me, even if it's just a coworker staying in the same building. I try to put the incident behind me, but I know that it will always be a part of my story. It's something that changed the way I see the world, a reminder that sometimes fear is real and it can come from the most ordinary places. Even though I'm not one to brag about my experiences, I felt that I had to share this story. I know that many people are out there working late nights alone, thinking that they're safe and that nothing will happen. But if you ever feel that something is off, if you ever hear those quiet sounds in an empty building, trust your gut. Don't ignore the feeling, no matter how small it seems. Sometimes being cautious is the difference between staying safe and finding yourself in a situation you can't control. I'm still working at that building, and every night I take extra care. I check every door and lock, I keep my phone on me, and I avoid being alone for too long. I have spoken to the management about upgrading the security, and while nothing dramatic has happened since, the memory of that night is always there, a constant reminder of how quickly things can change. I know this might sound like a long-winded story, but I wanted to share every detail because that night taught me a lot about fear, safety, and how quickly life can take an unexpected turn. I'm not trying to scare anyone, and I'm not claiming to be some kind of expert on security or mystery. I'm just a regular guy who had a night that changed everything, a night that I will never forget. In the end, I learned that the scariest things in life are often the ones that can be explained by human actions, not by forces we can't understand. It's the quiet moments, the slow build-up of tension, the small details that don't add up that make an ordinary night turn into something extraordinary in the worst way possible. I'm still trying to come to terms with it all, but I know that I'm stronger now for having faced it. If you ever find yourself working alone late at night, please be careful. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, don't ignore it. Call someone, lock the doors, and do whatever you need to do to stay safe. I learned my lesson the hard way, and I don't ever want to experience something like that again. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope that by sharing what happened to me, others might be more cautious and take steps to protect themselves. Sometimes the danger isn't something out of a horror movie, it's something very real, something that can happen in an office in Cleveland on an ordinary night. And that is what makes it all the more frightening.